A photograph sits in the Smithsonian's archives. Taken in 1903, it shows a woman named Sarah Paulson standing in front of a white, clapboard house in rural Tennessee. She is dressed in a cotton dress. Her hair is pinned up. She looks like any other Appalachian farm wife of the era. The caption, handwritten in faded ink, reads, "Sarah Paulson, Cherokee descent, Sevier County." Her family has told that story for 4 generations. Her great-great-granddaughter took a DNA test in 2019. 0% Native American. Not a fraction. Not a rounding error. 0. She is not alone. Right now, somewhere in America, a family is gathered around a kitchen table. Maybe it's Thanksgiving, maybe it's a birthday, and someone, probably an uncle, probably with great confidence, is telling the story. The story of the Cherokee great-great-grandmother, the high cheekbones, the dark hair, the land they once owned, the sadness in her eyes in that old photograph. 70 million Americans carry some version of this story. 70 million. That is larger than the entire population of France, larger than California, Texas, and New York combined. It is, by any statistical measure, one of the most widespread family myths in human history. And here's the problem. The actual Cherokee Nation, the enrolled, documented, legally recognized Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, has approximately 392,000 members. You do not need to be a mathematician to see the gap. If every single person who claimed Cherokee ancestry were actually Cherokee, the tribe would need to have been biologically larger than medieval England at its peak. The numbers do not work. They have never worked. And yet the story survives, generation after generation, passed down with the same certainty as eye color and last names. So what is actually happening here? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because buried inside that question is something far more unsettling than a family myth. It touches on how identity works in America, how race was constructed, negotiated, and sometimes fabricated across centuries. How a real people, a sophisticated, literate, politically complex civilization, became the canvas on which an entire nation projected its guilt, its romance, and its need to belong to something older than itself. Let's go back to Sarah Paulson for a moment. Her family's oral history says she was part Cherokee. It says her grandmother was removed during the Trail of Tears but escaped, hid in the mountains, and married a white man named Paulson. It's a compelling story. It has specific details, specific geography, a specific tragedy at its center. The DNA says otherwise. But here's the part that gets complicated. DNA tests as they exist today, the commercial ones you spit into a tube and mail off, are imperfect instruments for detecting Native American ancestry, particularly ancestry that is several generations back. Genetic ancestry companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA use reference populations to identify genetic patterns, and Native American reference populations in these databases are limited, incomplete, and shaped by the very history of colonization we're trying to understand. So the absence of a signal is not always proof of absence. But here is where it gets more complicated still. Researchers who have systematically studied Cherokee genealogy, including historians at the Cherokee Nation's own tribal registrar, have identified a pattern. A consistent, repeatable pattern. When families with strong oral traditions of Cherokee ancestry are traced back through historical records, a significant number of them hit a wall. Not a Cherokee wall, a different wall entirely. They find free black ancestors recorded as Cherokee or Indian on census documents to avoid legal reclassification during the antebellum period. They find Melungeon families, a mixed-race community of the Appalachian Mountains, whose complex ancestry was collapsed into Cherokee because it was the socially acceptable explanation for dark skin and ambiguous features. They find white families who adopted Cherokee identity in the 19th century as a kind of romantic nationalism, a way of claiming deep roots in American soil. And yes, in some cases, they find actual Cherokee ancestry, genuine, documented, real. The truth is not that all 70 million are lying. The truth is that the story they're telling is real to them, and real stories have real origins, even when those origins are not what anyone expected. Which raises the question that nobody in this conversation ever wants to ask. What do we actually know about who the Cherokee were, where they came from, and how they became who they are? Not the romantic version, not the textbook version, the version that genetics, archaeology, and linguistics have been quietly assembling for the last 30 years. A version that is stranger, more violent, more human, and ultimately more interesting than anything your uncle ever told you at Thanksgiving. That is what this investigation is about. Before we go any further, let's be precise about something. The Cherokee are not a myth. They are a real people with a continuous history, a living language, a sovereign government, and 392,000 enrolled citizens. Nothing in this investigation challenges their existence or their identity. What we are investigating is the mythology that grew up around them, and what that mythology reveals about America's relationship with its own history. The Cherokee Nation has its own historians, its own genealogists, its own scientists, and some of the most important findings in this story come from Cherokee scholars themselves, who have spent decades pushing back against the romantic distortions that have both celebrated and erased their actual history. When the Cherokee Principal Chief's office was asked to comment on the 70 million Americans phenomenon in a 2017 interview, the response was pointed. It's flattering and it's exhausting. People claim us when it's convenient and ignore us when it's not. That sentence is a key. Hold it. In the Cherokee Nation's registration office in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, genealogists receive hundreds of applications every year from people who want to prove their Cherokee descent. The office is meticulous. They work from the Dawes Rolls, the definitive census of the 5 civilized tribes conducted between 1898 and 1914, required by the U.S. government as a precondition for allotment of tribal land. If your Cherokee ancestor was alive during that period and enrolled, they appear on those rolls. If they don't appear, the legal chain breaks. Most applicants who arrive convinced of their Cherokee ancestry cannot trace that line to the Dawes Rolls. Most. But the geneticists are finding something that the genealogists can't fully explain with paper records alone. And that is where this story gets genuinely strange. Because the question of who the Cherokee are today depends entirely on understanding who lived in the Southern Appalachians before the word Cherokee even existed. And that story, the real deep history, is not the one being told in textbooks, family trees, or DNA databases. It is older, more layered, and it begins not with a tribe, but with a mystery. The version of Cherokee history that most Americans know can be summarized in 4 sentences. The Cherokee were one of the 5 civilized tribes of the American Southeast. They had a sophisticated culture, adopted many European customs, and even developed their own writing system in the early 19th century. In the 1830s, the U.S. government forcibly removed them from their ancestral lands in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Thousands died on the forced march westward, the Trail of Tears, and the survivors settled in what is now Oklahoma. That is not wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete, and the incompleteness is not accidental. The way this story has been told, with the Cherokee as noble, sophisticated, tragically displaced, serves a specific narrative function in American culture. They are the acceptable Native American story, civilized enough to be mourned, advanced enough to be admired, gone enough to be safe. Except they're not gone, and the real history doesn't fit the frame. Let's start with the number, 1540. That is the year that Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto led the first European expedition through the interior of the American Southeast. He was looking for gold. He brought 600 soldiers, horses, and war dogs. And he moved through a region that was, according to his chroniclers, densely populated, politically complex, and organized into competing chiefdoms. He encountered the Cherokee, or at least he encountered people who occupied the territory we would later call Cherokee territory. His chroniclers described large towns, palisaded fortifications, agricultural systems that could feed armies, and political hierarchies with paramount chiefs commanding wide regions. Here is the first crack in the standard story. The Cherokee oral tradition does not place their origins in the Southeast. It places them descending from the sky, emerging from water, arriving from somewhere else. This is not unusual for origin traditions. Most cultures have them. But the specificity of Cherokee tradition is notable. There are stories of migration, stories of encountering peoples already living in the mountains, stories of conflict with groups who were there before. The Cherokee were not, in their own oral tradition, the original inhabitants of their territory. Who was? Walk through the Great Smoky Mountains today, and you walk through a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for at least 12,000 years. The geological record and the archaeological record agree on this. The river valleys of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee were not empty waiting rooms. They were some of the most productive environments in North America, rich in game, fish, wild plants, with a climate mild enough to support agriculture. Somebody was always here. The question is who, and the answer changes in layers every few thousand years. The earliest confirmed inhabitants of this region belong to what archaeologists call the Paleoindian tradition. They arrived following megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, as those animals pushed into newly deglaciated environments around 13,000 years ago. These were small, mobile bands. They left behind projectile points, butchering sites, and almost nothing else. They were not Cherokee. They were not anything we have a name for. They are simply the first layer. But here is the part that should stop you cold. The genetic profile of those earliest Appalachian inhabitants, we constructed from ancient DNA extracted from sites in the region, shows a lineage that contributed significantly to later populations. Not replaced, contributed. Meaning that some of who they were survived into the people who came after and after and after. Which means the ancestry of anyone living in these mountains long enough is older than any tribal identity we have a name for. By the time DeSoto arrived in 1540, the cultural landscape of the Southeast had been shaped by at least three major population eras. The Paleoindians came first. Then came the woodland period cultures, more settled, more complex, building earthworks and developing long-distance trade networks that stretch from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Then came the Mississippian culture, the mound builders, the creators of large urban centers, the most complex pre-Columbian civilization east of the Mississippi River. All three of these layers were either gone, diminished, or in transformation by the time Europeans arrived. The Cherokee emerged into the historical record as distinct, named, geographically located, politically organized, only in the 17th and 18th centuries. That gap deserves attention. What happened between the collapse of Mississippian civilization around 1450 to 1500 AD and the appearance of the Cherokee as a recognizable polity in the 1600s? That is a 150-year period that is largely undocumented, understudied, and critical to understanding who the Cherokee actually were when Europeans finally wrote them down. The answer involves disease, collapse, migration, and a degree of ethnogenesis, the formation of a new ethnic identity from multiple source populations that the standard history almost entirely ignores. Consider a single town site, Coweta Creek, in what is now Macon County, North Carolina. Archaeologists excavated this site across multiple decades. What they found was a stratigraphic layer cake of occupation. The lowest levels showed woodland period material, ceramics, burial practices, structures, characteristic of a cultural tradition that predates anything we'd call Cherokee by 1,000 years. Above that, a transitional layer. Above that, clear Cherokee period material. The same ground. Different people, or the same people transformed? Probably both. Coweta Creek is not unique. Across the Cherokee homeland, archaeological sites show the same pattern of cultural layering. The story is not one of a people arriving and displacing another. It is a story of absorption, transformation, replacement, and continuity, all happening simultaneously over centuries. That is not the story that gets told around kitchen tables, and it is not the story that most people who claim Cherokee ancestry have any idea about. Because the real question, the one that this investigation is ultimately about, is not, did this family have a Cherokee ancestor? The real question is, what does it mean to be Cherokee if the Cherokee themselves were assembled from multiple populations across a 150-year period in the aftermath of one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history? And that question brings us to the event that changed everything. Not the Trail of Tears, something earlier. Something that happened before most Europeans had even reached this continent. Something that may have created the Cherokee as we know them from the ruins of civilizations we have almost entirely forgotten. Before the Cherokee, there were the mounds. If you have never stood at the base of a Mississippian platform mound, you cannot fully appreciate what the people who built them accomplished. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, Illinois is the largest, 100 feet tall, 14 acres at the base, containing more earth by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. But Cahokia was the capital. The empire extended south through the Ohio Valley, down the Mississippi, east into the Carolinas, west into Oklahoma. At its height, around 1100 AD, the Mississippian world was the most populated region of North America, north of Mexico. The people who built these mounds were not primitive. They were urban. They had specialists, priests, warriors, craftspeople, merchants. They had long-distance trade networks. They had political hierarchies sophisticated enough to compel labor from thousands of people across generations. They had art, ceremony, agriculture, and astronomy. They had cities. And then, by around 1450, the great centers were collapsing. Archaeologists have been arguing about the reasons for that collapse for decades. Climate change played a role. A medieval warm period gave way to the beginning of the Little Ice Age, disrupting agriculture. Political instability was certainly a factor, but the most significant force was probably the thing that destroyed every major pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas: epidemic disease. Not European disease, not yet. That is a common misconception. Some researchers now believe that diseases may have begun moving through Native American trade networks even before sustained European contact, possibly transmitted through early coastal encounters, possibly through domesticated animals, possibly through mechanisms we don't fully understand. The evidence is debated. But the timing is suggestive. Between 1450 and 1550, population centers across the American Southeast collapsed with a speed that archaeology can document, but that historians have struggled to fully explain. By the time De Soto's expedition walked through in 1540, he was traversing what his chroniclers described as a densely populated, politically complex landscape: large towns, palisaded fortifications, sophisticated agriculture. 50 years later, when the next wave of European explorers and settlers arrived, they found those same areas largely depopulated. Empty towns, overgrown fields, forests reclaiming cleared land. One generation, an entire civilization gone. Let's put a specific number on this. Epidemiologists who specialize in pre-Columbian population history estimate that the southeastern United States contained somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people at the time of first European contact. By 1700, 150 years after sustained contact, that population had declined to approximately 200,000. Some estimates are even lower. That is a mortality rate of 85 to 90%. Not battle deaths, not displacement, death. From smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Diseases for which Native American populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immune memory. Stand in that number for a moment. Imagine 9 out of every 10 people you know dying within a few generations. Not from a single catastrophic event, but from wave after wave of epidemic. One disease arriving before the survivors of the last had fully recovered. The social structures that survived that catastrophe were not the structures that existed before it. They couldn't be. The priests who maintained ceremonial knowledge died. The leaders who held political alliances together died. The farmers who knew how to manage the complex agricultural systems died. The traders who maintained the long-distance networks died. What survived was fragments. Remnant groups from multiple decimated populations forced to recombine, to find new structures, to create new identities from the pieces of old ones. This is the process that anthropologists call ethnogenesis. And there is now substantial evidence, archaeological, genetic, and linguistic, that the Cherokee as a distinct ethnic group were created through exactly this process. Not discovered, created. Not from nothing, but from the reorganization of populations that have existed in the region for centuries, forced together by catastrophe into a new collective identity. The Cherokee language is Iroquoian. If you know anything about North American linguistics, that fact should stop you immediately. Iroquoian languages, the family that includes Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, are associated with the Great Lakes region and the northeastern woodlands. Cherokee is the southernmost Iroquoian language by a geographic margin of several hundred miles. The nearest Iroquoian speakers, geographically, were the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, far to the north. How does an Iroquoian language end up in the southern Appalachians? The standard explanation is migration. At some point in the deep past, a group of Iroquoian speakers separated from the main cluster and moved south. This is plausible, but linguists who have analyzed Cherokee in depth have noted that it is sufficiently divergent from northern Iroquoian languages to suggest separation at a considerable time depth, possibly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, possibly longer. That is a very long time to maintain a distinct language in isolation from its relatives. Here's where linguistics and archaeology produce an interesting collision. The earliest Cherokee-associated archaeological sites in the southern Appalachians date to approximately 1000 AD. This is the period archaeologists call the Pisgah phase, associated with a distinct ceramic tradition, specific architectural patterns, and burial customs that clearly link to later, historically documented Cherokee culture. But 1000 AD is far more recent than the 3,500-year linguistic separation estimate. If Cherokee speakers have been in the southern Appalachians for 3,500 years, why does the material culture only crystallize into recognizable Cherokee form around 1,000 years ago? One possibility. The Iroquoian speakers were always in the mountains, but for most of their history they were absorbed into, or absorbed from, surrounding Mississippian cultural traditions, leaving little distinct archaeological trace. Only after Mississippian collapse did a specifically Cherokee cultural identity re-emerge and solidify. Another possibility. The linguistic separation happened in the mountains, not before arrival. A population that spoke a language ancestral to both Cherokee and Northern Iroquoian was already in the mountains when the northern branch split off and moved northward. Cherokee is not the southern outlier. Cherokee is the original population. The Haudenosaunee are the ones who moved. This is not the mainstream view, but it is a serious hypothesis held by serious linguists, and the implications are significant. Now layer on top of that the genetic evidence. Ancient DNA studies from the southeastern United States published in the last decade have revealed the population history far more complex than anyone anticipated. The pre-Mississippian populations of the southeast show genetic profiles that do not map cleanly onto modern tribal identities. There is not a simple line connecting ancient person buried at site X to modern tribe Y. What there is instead is a layered pattern of population replacement, admixture, and continuity that looks different in different regions and at different time periods. The core Appalachian mountain populations show a degree of genetic continuity, a thread of ancestry that persists across thousands of years despite the cultural upheavals visible in the archaeological record. That thread does not belong to the Cherokee as a named group. It belongs to people who were in those mountains before the Cherokee had a name, and who may have contributed genetically and culturally to the Cherokee as we know them. In 1838, a man named Solly hid in the mountains of western North Carolina rather than submit to removal. His story is part of Cherokee legend. He killed 2 soldiers during a struggle at the removal camp. He fled into the Smoky Mountains. The U.S. Army offered a deal. If Solly turned himself in, the remaining mountain Cherokee, around 1,000 people, could stay. He surrendered. He was executed by firing squad. And because of that, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians exists today. That group, the Eastern Band, never went to Oklahoma. They stayed in the mountains. They are the lineal descendants of people who lived in those specific mountains before removal, and in many cases, before contact. When geneticists have studied Eastern Band members as part of broader indigenous genomics projects, what they find is precisely that thread of deep Appalachian ancestry. Continuity across thousands of years. Not a migration from somewhere else, not an arrival, a presence. But here is the thing about that genetic continuity. It does not belong exclusively to people who call themselves Cherokee. It appears at lower levels in populations across the entire southern Appalachian region, including some populations who have no tribal identity, no enrollment status, and no family tradition of indigenous ancestry whatsoever. Which means the relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural identity in this region is far more complicated than a DNA test or a family story can capture. And it means that when we ask, who were the Cherokee, we need to also ask a harder question. Who was absorbing whom, and when, and why? Because the genetic evidence doesn't just track ancestry, it tracks events. Specific, catastrophic events that leave marks in DNA that last for generations. And the evidence from the Cherokee period, the historical period, the 17th and 18th centuries, shows exactly the kind of mark you'd expect from a people being destroyed. In 2020, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Current Biology analyzing ancient DNA from 91 individuals recovered from sites across the American Southeast, spanning roughly 6,000 years of prehistory. The paper received modest attention in academic circles and almost none in mainstream media. It should have been front-page news. Here is what they found. Around 1000 AD, the period corresponding to the expansion of Mississippian culture, there was a major genetic shift across the Southeast. New ancestry components appeared in the ancient DNA record that were not present in earlier samples. This was not gradual drift. It was a relatively rapid replacement of existing genetic profiles with new ones. Meaning, Mississippian expansion was not just cultural. It was, at least in part, demographic. People moved. New populations arrived in territories previously occupied by different groups. Old populations were displaced, absorbed, or eliminated. The people who built the Great Mounds were not the same people, genetically, as those who came before them in the same landscape. What the researchers expected to find was a relatively stable genetic landscape with gradual change over time, the pattern you'd expect from a region with long-term in situ cultural development. What they found was punctuated change, sharp discontinuities, followed by new stability, followed by another discontinuity. The Southeast was not a peaceful region of gradual cultural evolution. It was a region that experienced repeated episodes of population upheaval, each of which reset the genetic landscape of at least some areas. Now focus on a specific skull. In 2016, bioarchaeologists working at a Mississippian period site in Tennessee, a large town site occupied between approximately 1200 and 1450 AD, completed isotopic and ancient DNA analysis on skeletal material from a burial mound. The site had been excavated over decades by the University of Tennessee. The skeletal material was extensive, hundreds of individuals, multiple burial contexts, evidence of both ordinary deaths and mass violence. The ancient DNA from this site showed a population that was genetically distinct from both earlier woodland period populations in the same region and from later historically documented Cherokee populations. They were the Mississippians, and they were not Cherokee. This is not a small finding. It means that whatever population is ancestral to the Cherokee did not straightforwardly descend from the Mississippian population that preceded them in the same territory. The question is, what happened to the Mississippians? Part of the answer is disease. The epidemic waves of the 16th century would have hit Mississippian populations with full force. These were urban people living in densely packed towns along major waterways, exactly the conditions that maximize epidemic spread. Their population densities made them more vulnerable, not less, to epidemic disease. But part of the answer is something darker, and the archaeological record is explicit about it. At multiple Mississippian sites in the Southeast, the final occupation layers, the levels that represent the last people living there before abandonment, show evidence of violence. Mass graves, skeletal trauma consistent with warfare, evidence of trophy taking, skulls and long bones treated in ways that suggest ritual decapitation and defleshing, evidence of burned structures and rapid abandonment. Some of this violence was intercommunity, competing chiefdoms attacking each other as political structures collapsed. Some of it may have been warfare between Mississippian remnant groups and the ancestors of historical tribes. Some of it may have been associated with European Allied raiding. The mound builders did not peacefully fade away. Some of them were killed. Some of them fled. And some of them, this is the part that matters, were absorbed into the populations that survived them. Here is the full picture that the DNA, the archaeology, and the linguistics are assembling. Before the Cherokee, there were multiple populations in the southern Appalachians. Some had been there for thousands of years. Some had arrived more recently as part of Mississippian expansion. They spoke different languages, practiced different cultural traditions, and had different genetic profiles. The epidemic catastrophe of the 16th century reduced all of those populations catastrophically. The survivors, fragments of multiple different groups, were forced into proximity by depopulation, by the collapse of former territories, and by the pressure of European expansion beginning in the early 17th century. In that crucible, a new collective identity formed, the Cherokee. They adopted a common name, a common political structure, the clan system, which operated across what had previously been separate local communities, a common ceremonial language rooted in Iroquoian but incorporating elements from other linguistic traditions. and a shared territory, which was the territory of the mountains, defined not by ancient continuous occupation, but by the accident of who survived where. Dr. Robbie Etheridge, a historian at the University of Mississippi who has spent her career studying what she calls the Mississippian Shatter Zone, has documented this process in detail for the southeastern United States as a whole. Her work shows that virtually every major historical tribe of the Southeast, not just the Cherokee, but the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, was assembled through ethnogenesis following epidemic collapse and political fragmentation. These were not ancient tribes that Europeans discovered. They were new peoples, formed in response to catastrophe, creating new identities from the ruins of old ones. That is not a diminishment. If anything, it is more remarkable. To survive civilizational collapse and reassemble a coherent social identity is one of the most extraordinary things a human community can do. But it does complicate the mythology of ancient, continuous, unchanging tribal identity. Now place this in the context of the Cherokee DNA tests. When a 23andMe result comes back showing no Native American ancestry, what is it actually measuring? It is comparing your DNA against reference populations, modern indigenous people who have consented to contribute to databases. Those reference populations are drawn from living communities, which are themselves the product of the same ethnogenesis process. And those databases are incomplete, particularly for southeastern tribes. The 2020 Current Biology study found that the ancient DNA of pre-contact southeastern populations showed genetic profiles that do not match closely to modern Native American reference populations, including those of southeastern tribes. They were genetically distinct, not because they weren't Native American, but because the ancient Southeast had its own unique genetic history that was partially disrupted and replaced during the Mississippian era and again during the epidemic catastrophe of the 16th and 17th centuries. Which means, if you had actual Cherokee ancestry from before, say, 1700, it might look different in a modern DNA test than if you had Cherokee ancestry from 1800. Because the Cherokee themselves changed genetically during that period, through epidemic mortality, through the incorporation of European and African ancestry during the colonial era, through the small population sizes that magnify genetic drift. The test is not wrong, but it is measuring something more complicated than ancestry. Before we go further, because what's coming next is the part of this story that most history books have never told, I want to pause for a moment. If you've been watching this series and you want to explore your own family's deep history, there are free resources that can get you started. The Dawes Rolls database, which is publicly searchable online, the Cherokee Nation's own genealogy resources, and JSTOR, which provides free access to academic papers on indigenous genetics to registered users. But if you want the full picture, the genetic analysis, the documentary evidence, and the historical context all in one place, the resource in the description pulls all of that together. It's not magic. It won't tell you what your DNA doesn't contain, but it will help you understand what your results actually mean in the context of a population history as complicated as the one we're uncovering right now. The link is below. But stay with me, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about who is here, what happened to them, and why it still matters. In 1738, smallpox arrived in Cherokee territory. It was not the first epidemic. The Cherokee had already experienced multiple waves of European disease in the preceding century, but 1738 was different. The epidemic that year spread through the Cherokee towns with catastrophic speed, and when it was over, the Cherokee themselves recorded what had happened. They had lost approximately half their population in a single year. Half. Contemporary accounts, both Cherokee and European, describe towns that had been emptied, trading partners who had simply ceased to exist, families where only one or two people survived from dozens. An elder woman in the Overhill towns is recorded as saying, through an interpreter, that she had buried everyone she knew. Everyone. The psychological impact of that kind of loss is something we barely have language for. The sociological impact, the loss of institutional knowledge, of cultural memory, of the specific people who carried specific roles, is equally devastating. But the genetic impact is what is visible to science today. Geneticists call it a bottleneck. When a population is severely reduced through disease, disaster, or violence, the survivors carry only a fraction of the genetic diversity of the original population. Everything that was lost with the dead is gone from the gene pool. The survivors rebuild, but they rebuild from a narrow foundation. The Cherokee population, measured by any available metric, went through at least 3 major bottlenecks in the historical period. The 1738 epidemic, the catastrophic mortality of the Revolutionary War era, when Cherokee towns were systematically destroyed by American militias, not just the Trail of Tears, but 20 years of warfare before it, burning of crops, destruction of towns, killing of civilians. And the Trail of Tears itself, which historians now estimate killed between 4,000 and 8,000 people out of a population of approximately 16,000, a mortality rate of 25 to 50% on the march alone. 3 bottlenecks in 100 years. The genetic record of modern Cherokee people carries all 3 of them. In the reduced diversity of certain genetic markers, in the elevated frequency of specific genetic variants that happen to be common among survivors, in the patterns that population geneticists call founder effects, the signature of rebuilding a population from a small number of ancestors. Here is the finding that should make you stop. In a 2015 study examining mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, in enrolled members of the Cherokee Nation, researchers identified a striking pattern. Certain mitochondrial haplogroups, genetic lineages that trace maternal ancestry, were present at very high frequencies compared to neighboring indigenous populations. Specifically, haplogroup A, one of the founding haplogroups of the Americas, was present at frequencies suggesting that a significant proportion of modern Cherokee members share a common maternal ancestor who lived within the last 300 to 400 years. Not 3,000 years ago, 300 to 400 years ago. This is the genetic signature of the 1738 bottleneck. When half the population dies in a year, the survivors, particularly those from specific towns, specific clans, specific family lines that happen to have some degree of immune advantage, or who happen not to be exposed at the peak of infection, their lineages dominate the gene pool of every subsequent generation. The Cherokee you see today, 392,000 enrolled citizens, are, in a measurable genetic sense, the descendants of the people who survived 1738. Not the people who existed before 1738, the survivors. Now connect this to the 70 million claimants. Many of the families that carry oral traditions of Cherokee ancestry trace those stories to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the period immediately following the bottleneck events. And this is where the history becomes genuinely complex, in ways that cannot be resolved by DNA or by paper records alone. Following the epidemics and the Revolutionary War era destruction of Cherokee towns, the surviving Cherokee population reorganized. They rebuilt their towns, they created new political structures, and they did something that is historically documented but rarely discussed. They incorporated outsiders. Cherokee clans, the fundamental unit of Cherokee social organization, could adopt non-Cherokee individuals. This was not a peripheral practice. It was a central mechanism of social reproduction in a society that had lost enormous numbers of people. Captured individuals, particularly women and children, were frequently adopted into clans and became, in all socially meaningful ways, Cherokee. Some of these adoptees were from other Native American groups. Some were European traders who married into Cherokee families. And some, this is the documented, historically uncomfortable part, were African Americans, both free and enslaved, who were incorporated into Cherokee society in complex ways that varied by time period, region, and clan. The Cherokee owned enslaved black people. This is a fact that Cherokee history has grappled with for decades, and that modern Cherokee citizens debate openly. It is also a fact that complicates the genetic picture in ways that matter for this story. Because the children of enslaved black women and Cherokee men, or of free black people incorporated into Cherokee clans, were genetically mixed in ways that would register on modern DNA tests as sub-Saharan African ancestry, not Native American ancestry. And some of the families who claim Cherokee ancestry today, but test as African American in their DNA, may actually be describing a real historical relationship, just not the one they think they're describing. There is a man named John Martin who appears in the Dawes rolls as Cherokee Freedman. His descendants have fought for enrollment rights for over a century. The Cherokee Freedmen, the descendants of people enslaved by Cherokee slaveholders who were granted Cherokee citizenship by treaty in 1866, have been enrolled, disenrolled, re-enrolled, and stripped of citizenship rights through a series of legal and political battles that continue into the present decade. In 2021, the Cherokee Nation reaffirmed the citizenship of Cherokee freedmen following a Supreme Court decision. There are now approximately 9,000 enrolled Cherokee freedmen citizens. Their DNA does not look Cherokee in the way that genetic ancestry companies define that category. Many of them show primarily or entirely African genetic ancestry, and yet they are, by treaty, by law, and by history, Cherokee citizens. This is the most important finding of this entire investigation, and it has been hiding in plain sight. Identity is not genetics. Genetics is one thread in a story that includes law, history, culture, language, community, and political choice. The Cherokee Nation has, imperfectly and contentiously, maintained a legal and political definition of membership that is partially, but not entirely, genetic in its logic. The Dawes Rolls were a political document, not a biological one. They recorded who the U.S. government recognized as Cherokee in 1898 to 1914, based on criteria that were, themselves, politically contested. The families who carry stories of Cherokee great-great-grandmothers and test negative for Native American DNA are in some cases carrying a memory of real historical connection to adoption, to marriage, to political affiliation that does not register in genetic ancestry testing because genetic ancestry testing is not designed to detect those things. And the families who test positive for Native American ancestry but cannot document enrollment in the Dawes Rolls are in some cases carrying real genetic ancestry from historical relationships that were never officially recorded because the people involved had reasons: survival, fear, legal status, not to be officially recorded. The most unsettling finding is this: the story that 70 million Americans tell about their Cherokee ancestry is wrong in the specific details, but right about something deeper. They are right that something happened in the southern Appalachians across several centuries that left traces in American families that cannot easily be categorized. They are right that the lines between Native American, European, and African ancestry in that region were far more porous than official history recorded. They are right that identity was negotiated, performed, adopted, and sometimes hidden. They are wrong about the specific ancestor. They are wrong about the high cheekbones being a reliable genetic signal. They are wrong about the story being as simple as a Cherokee great-great-grandmother who survived the Trail of Tears. But the impulse behind the story, the sense that something real happened, something that left a mark, something worth claiming, that impulse is not entirely disconnected from actual history. Here is what we know. The Cherokee did not emerge from the mists of time as a single, ancient, unchanging people. They were assembled through migration, survival, adoption, ethnogenesis, and catastrophe over the course of approximately 150 years following the collapse of Mississippian civilization and the onset of European epidemic disease. They incorporated people from multiple prior populations. They survived bottlenecks so severe that modern genetic analysis can still read the scars. They are real. They are here. And their sovereignty, their legal identity, their tribal citizenship are not in dispute. The 70 million Americans who claim Cherokee ancestry are not, for the most part, claiming something that is genetically verifiable, but they are responding to something real in American history, a period of several centuries during which the boundaries between indigenous, African, and European ancestry in the American South were genuinely porous, and during which those boundaries were often deliberately obscured for reasons of survival, legal status, and social identity. The grandmother story is almost never literally true, but it is not entirely invented either. It is a distorted memory of something real, of contact, connection, and complexity that official history was not equipped to record. Now pull back to the largest possible scale. Every human being alive today is the descendant of people who survived catastrophe. Every population on Earth has gone through bottlenecks, migrations, collapses, and reorganizations. Every ethnic identity that exists today was assembled from prior populations through processes that involved violence, disease, adoption, and cultural transformation. There is no population on Earth that has existed unchanged since time immemorial. The Cherokee story is a particularly clear example of this process because it happened recently enough to be partially documented, and because modern genetics is sophisticated enough to partially reconstruct it. But the lesson is universal. Identity is not blood. Blood is one ingredient in a story that includes law, language, culture, history, political choice, and collective memory. The Cherokee Nation knows this better than almost anyone. They have had to defend their identity against both erasure by the US government and appropriation by the 70 million Americans who want to claim a piece of it. The Trail of Tears was real. The deaths were real. Their survival was extraordinary. And the people who survived built something new from the ruins of what was lost. That is the story that deserves to be told. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 6. Which discovery in this video surprised you most? 1. The 70 million gap. 2. The Mississippian collapse. 3. The 1738 bottleneck. 4. The Iroquoian language mystery. 5. The Cherokee freedman story. Or 6. The ethnogenesis finding. Drop your number below. Send this video to one person who still thinks their family's Cherokee ancestor story is straightforward. Not to argue with them, but because one conversation with the right information can change how someone understands where they come from. Next time, in the archives of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, there is a collection of skeletal material from a single site in the Ohio Valley, excavated in 1934, analyzed in 2019, that shows something the original excavators could not have predicted. A genetic profile that matches no known tribe, no known migration route, and no existing model of pre-Columbian population history in eastern North America. The date on the analysis report is 2019. The finding has not been published in a mainstream journal. I have the document. Next video, I show you what's in it and what it means for every map you've ever seen of who was here first.